The millionaire pointed his finger, sneered, and shouted, "Shut up and work." Destiny barely blinked, her hands trembling as she clutched the silver tray. He didn't know her name. He didn't care. To him, she was invisible, just another uniform, another black face in the background serving without question. But 5 minutes later, he would be on his knees, tears clinging to the corners of his eyes, his expensive cufflinks glinting against the ballroom floor as he begged her, not for water, not for champagne, but for mercy. And the entire room would bear witness. What happened in those 5 minutes wasn't just about spilled wine or bruised egos. It was about what he didn't see, about who Destiny really was, and what she carried with her. It would cost him everything, his reputation, his influence, even his freedom. Because this story isn't about a mistake. It's about history, about inheritance, and about a man whose greatest miscalculation wasn't his words, it was who he said them to. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this maid, really? To the guests swirling through the gala in gowns and tuxedos, she was no one. Just another gloved hand pouring champagne. Just another soft voice saying, "Excuse me," as she passed with her tray. But Destiny Harris was not just the hired help. She had been watching Charles Whitmore for months, moving in the background, unnoticed, forgotten, exactly how she wanted it. She memorized his habits, studied his weaknesses, and waited for the perfect moment. Why did she stay silent for so long? Why didn't she speak when he barked at her? When his words cut through her dignity like a blade in silk? Because Destiny wasn't there to react. She was there to reveal. What secret did she know that could bring a billionaire to his knees in front of 1,000 silent guests? And who else saw what Charles didn't, that something was about to snap? Because just a few feet away, beneath the shadows of a marble column, another figure stood completely still, unmoving, unblinking, watching. And when Destiny looked up briefly, their eyes met. Not with fear, but recognition. As if this moment had been rehearsed long before the first guest arrived. Destiny Harris moved through the marble ballroom with practiced precision, each step measured, each breath steady. To the guests she passed, she was invisible, a 34-year-old African-American maid in a crisp black uniform, hair neatly pulled back, expression unreadable. But behind that stillness was a woman carrying more than just trays. Every night after her shift, she rode the train back to a 2-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, where her mother, Martha, lay tethered to an oxygen tank, her body weakened by illness and years of forgotten dreams. Destiny worked double shifts, never complained, and never asked for help. She was graceful in the way people who've been hurt often are, quiet, deliberate, impossibly strong. But there was a past she never talked about, a name she no longer used, and a fire that hadn't gone out, just moved deeper. Charles Whitmore, meanwhile, was everything Destiny wasn't allowed to be: loud, powerful, and shameless. At 58, he had bulldozed his way into real estate royalty, the kind of man who didn't just buy buildings, he bought silence. City permits bent around his donations, competitors vanished into bankruptcies, and women who spoke out were dismissed or buried under settlements. He thrived on control, feared only embarrassment, and ruled with a smile that never reached his eyes. At every public event, he was the center of attention, but his private cruelty was no secret to those beneath him. Waiters, drivers, janitors, they all knew to move fast and stay out of his way, because Charles didn't just fire people, he destroyed them. And on the night of the gala, he arrived like a king, unaware that a reckoning was already standing in the room. Near the far end of the ballroom, partially veiled by the shimmer of the chandeliers, stood Angela Coleman. She wore a long black gown with no jewelry, her posture elegant but watchful. She spoke to no one, smiled at nothing. Her presence didn't draw attention, but it held weight. And though no one asked who she was, several noticed the way Destiny glanced her way more than once. Their connection was unspoken, invisible, but it was there. And for the first time in years, Charles Whitmore was being watched, not by his admirers, but by those he thought he'd buried. The gala pulsed with soft jazz, the clink of crystal, and the low hum of Manhattan's elite congratulating themselves. The ballroom, 30 stories above the city, glittered in gold and candlelight. Waiters moved like shadows, and Destiny Harris, as always, remained unnoticed among them. She carried a tray of aged Bordeaux in her right hand, balancing it easily as she wove through silk gowns and velvet tuxedos. The hotel had hosted hundreds of these events, but tonight carried a strange air, tight, expectant. Destiny felt it but didn't show it. She kept her face composed, her eyes down. Then it happened. Just as she stepped toward the head table to refill a glass, someone brushed past her. Not enough to knock her off balance, but enough to shift the tray ever so slightly. One glass tilted, then tipped, and in an instant, red wine was spilling down the white sleeve of Charles Whitmore's $1,000 suit. He jolted in his seat, eyes wide, his mouth twisted in disbelief. For a second, there was silence. Destiny froze, clutching the now empty tray. Then Charles stood slowly, and then he exploded. His voice cut through the room like a blade. "Are you blind or just stupid?" The room stilled. "This is why you people shouldn't be allowed anywhere near these events." A few guests gasped. Others looked away. But no one stepped in. No one told him to stop. The band fell silent, the soft piano keys trailing off into nothing. Destiny stood there, unmoving, her face unreadable. She didn't apologize. She didn't speak. Charles stepped closer. "I said clean it up. Do your job. You're lucky to be in this room at all. Just shut up and work." The words hit the room harder than the wine had hit his sleeve. Still, Destiny didn't move. Her hands gripped the tray tighter. Her chin lifted, just slightly, and her eyes met his for the first time. And then, quietly, just loud enough for him to hear, she said, "You should have checked the guest list." Charles blinked, confused. The words didn't make sense, not at first, but something about the way she said it, calm, measured, knowing, made him hesitate. He looked around the room, suddenly aware that dozens of eyes were on him. Phones had been raised, cameras were pointed, and someone, just out of view, was still watching from the shadows. A woman in a black gown who hadn't moved all night. Angela Coleman's gaze was fixed directly on him now, and for the first time all evening, she smiled. By morning, the footage had already gone viral. A shaky phone recording taken from across the ballroom showed every second of Charles Whitmore's outburst. The sharpness of his voice, the venom in his tone, the way Destiny Harris stood frozen with wine pooling around her shoes. It was all there. And the moment he snarled, "Shut up and work," the internet reacted like a lit fuse meeting gasoline. Hashtags bloomed across social media. Who eyes Destiny? Cancel Whitmore. Power and privilege. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story. Real estate mogul humiliates Maid at gala. Charles Whitmore's racist rant sparks outrage. Overnight, the man once praised for rebuilding the city was now accused of everything it seemed he had buried. But Destiny Harris was nowhere to be found. She hadn't returned home. She didn't clock in for her next shift at the Manhattan hotel. Co-workers said nothing. Supervisors gave rehearsed answers. Her apartment door in Brooklyn remained closed, and her mother, Martha, refused to speak to anyone. It was as if Destiny had simply vanished into the noise she'd created. And that silence, that absence, only fueled the storm. One journalist, Olivia Tran, started pulling threads. A crime and business reporter for an independent outlet, she had been covering men like Charles Whitmore for years. But this story felt different. Olivia dug into employment records, hotel contracts, gala attendees. Then one name caught her eye. Camille Harris, listed once, on a business partnership filing dated nearly 2 decades earlier. Not as staff, but as co-founder. Camille Harris and Charles Whitmore, equal partners in a real estate company that no longer existed. Olivia dug deeper. She found sealed court documents, a withdrawn lawsuit, and a closed police file. Camille had accused Whitmore of fraud, theft, and sexual misconduct. The case never went to trial. Camille disappeared shortly after filing the complaint. No one had seen her again. No body, no formal investigation, just a quiet settlement and a long, collective forgetting. But Camille hadn't just vanished. She had left something behind. Destiny. Her niece. Raised by Camille's sister, Destiny had grown up hearing stories whispered behind closed doors. Stories about power, betrayal, and a man who had taken everything. Destiny had always known Charles Whitmore's name, but she never imagined one day he'd speak hers in front of hundreds, not knowing that with every word he was digging his own grave. Camille Harris wasn't just a maid. She was once Charles Whitmore's business partner, and she didn't vanish. She was erased after accusing him of theft, manipulation, and assault. But what Whitmore didn't know was that the truth didn't vanish with Camille. It had been waiting, in Destiny's memory, in her blood, and now it was coming back to finish what Camille had started. Destiny Harris was never just a maid. That was the role she played, carefully, deliberately, without flaw. But beneath the uniform and silent steps was a woman who had spent years gathering every scrap of paper, every stray email, every hushed conversation she could trace back to one man, Charles Whitmore. Her quiet life was a mask, her daily shifts a form of shadow work, and her presence at the gala was no accident. She wasn't there to serve wine. She was there to strike. Buried in a locked box beneath her mother's floorboards were the documents, original contracts, old ledgers, and 2 signed statements from former employees who had disappeared from public record. Names erased from corporate history, receipts for slush funds, shell companies registered in the Caribbean, transfers signed with Whitmore's initials. Camille Harris had gathered the evidence before she filed the complaint. She had documented everything, and before she disappeared, she had given them to her sister. Destiny had kept them safe all these years. Angela Coleman had known exactly where Destiny was. She had watched her grow, mentored her from afar, funded her education under different names, and she had promised Camille before the settlement, before the silence, that when Destiny was ready, she would stand beside her. Angela wasn't just a guest at the gala. She was its sponsor. She had orchestrated the evening, designed the guest list, and placed Destiny exactly where she needed to be. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was justice, executed with the elegance of a chess master. And Charles had never seen it coming. When Destiny finally reappeared, this time not in uniform but in a navy blue blouse, seated across from Charles Whitmore's attorney in a quiet corner of his midtown office, she said nothing at first. The lawyer slid a thick envelope across the polished table. You could walk away from this with more than most people see in a lifetime. No courts, no press. You and your mother, set for life. Destiny stared at the envelope for a moment. Then slowly, without a word, she pushed it back toward him. The lawyer's face faltered. You don't understand, he said, suddenly unsure. Destiny finally spoke. No, she said softly. You don't understand. That money? It's already mine. You just didn't know I'd come for it. The lawyer glanced toward the door, suddenly uneasy. In that moment, he realized what Charles had failed to see. This wasn't blackmail. This wasn't a shakedown. This was a reckoning. Destiny opened her bag and laid out the documents across the table, each one signed, each one dated, each one authenticated. Angela Coleman's legal team had vetted everything. They'd waited patiently for the day Destiny would walk into that room and say, "We don't want a settlement. We want accountability." And outside, just beyond the walls of the office, reporters were already gathering. The story had broken. The cameras were rolling. Charles Whitmore's kingdom had begun to fall. And Destiny Harris, once the silent girl in the background, was finally being heard. It didn't happen quietly. Charles Whitmore had silenced so many voices over the years with money, with legal pressure, with fear. But when the news broke, it didn't break in whispers. It exploded. The documents Destiny Harris had delivered were airtight. Not just decades-old signatures and transactions, but audio recordings Camille Harris had made before her disappearance. Voice memos, conversations with accountants, threats from Charles himself. All preserved, all authenticated, all admissible. The press ran with it like wildfire. Headlines screamed, "Real estate tycoon Charles Whitmore under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, obstruction." The man who once controlled mayors and media couldn't even control his own front door. Federal agents arrived at his penthouse at dawn. He answered the door in a robe, bewildered and desperate. But the camera crews had already gathered. As he was led away in handcuffs, a reporter shouted the question that echoed through the city. "Do you have anything to say to Destiny Harris?" Charles didn't answer. His silence was the first honest thing he'd given in years. The fallout was swift. His board, stacked with yes-men and silent partners, held an emergency vote. Angela Coleman, who had remained quiet through it all, finally stepped forward. She presented the case for Whitmore's removal not just as a legal obligation, but a moral one. Her voice calm, her facts indisputable, her legacy intact. By unanimous vote, Charles Whitmore was ousted from the empire he had built on lies. And Angela? She was voted in as interim CEO, with a permanent recommendation already in motion. The same woman who had watched from the shadows now stood at the helm, quiet power finally made visible. 2 months later, the same ballroom where it all began was lit in soft gold and silver. But this time, there were no tuxedos bought for appearances, no veiled insults hiding behind forced smiles. This time, the crowd stood in quiet reverence. At the center of the room stood Destiny Harris, not in uniform, but in an ivory suit. Calm, poised. Everything her aunt had once been and more. She stepped to the podium, cleared her throat, and looked out across the room. She didn't start with anger. She didn't list Charles Whitmore's crimes. She began with Camille's name. She told the story of a woman who tried to do the right thing, who had trusted the wrong man, and who paid the price for it. She spoke of mothers and daughters, of silence and survival, and of how strength sometimes looks like stillness. Then she introduced the Camille Harris Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting women silenced by power, funded by the very assets Whitmore once used to silence others. The applause rose slowly but filled the room like thunder, and as she stepped away from the podium, a young reporter asked the final question of the night. "Destiny, after everything he did to you, everything he took, what would you say to him now?" Destiny paused, then smiled, the same calm smile she wore the night of the gala, and with perfect stillness she said, "The maid you screamed at just bought the building you used to run." What started as public humiliation became something far deeper, something most people only dream of seeing in their lifetime. It became poetic justice, delivered not in anger, not with noise, but with precision, patience, and unshakable grace. Destiny Harris didn't throw a fit, didn't shout in defense, didn't demand recognition. She stood still while the world tried to make her invisible. And then, when the time was right, she stepped forward, not for applause, but for truth. She didn't just expose Charles Whitmore. She dismantled everything he built with silence and power. She became the very thing he feared most, a woman with a voice, a legacy, and nothing to lose. But now, as the dust settles, we're left with a question. Was this revenge? Or was it redemption? Did destiny strike too late, or just in time? And if you were in her shoes, if someone had humiliated you, erased your family, stolen your history, would you have waited as long as she did? Or would you have struck back sooner? Let us know in the comments below. Every thought, every opinion, every piece of the story you saw differently. We read them all. Subscribe now, because you won't want to miss what's coming next.